it's delicious.
In PUBG, the mid-game can be one of the most deceptive portions of the game in terms of survival. While you can go several minutes without seeing other players, it's still easy to be caught off guard by other players or difficult to find ways to keep yourself safe as you move into the later circles. Whether you play compound to compound or edge of the circle, every direction, including from inside the blue zone, has the potential for danger. So, for this episode of Why You Suck at PUBG, we're going to take a look at tips you can use in the mid-game to help keep you alive and into those final circles. Before we even load into the plane, the first thing everyone does is look at the map and decide where they're going to drop. What players often overlook or don't pay enough attention to is the flight path of the plane. This key piece of information isn't really relevant right away in terms of survival in the early game, but it's nonetheless important to make a note of for later. The next thing we want to be watching for is where people land in relation to your location. Because so much can happen throughout the shifting of the play zones as the game progresses, you really only want to concern yourself with the other players who landed within 1,000 to 1,500 meters from you. Since these are going to be the main opposition in advancing to the mid to late game, these are the ones we want to focus on. Let's start by showing a pretty basic early game scenario. We first start by looking at the other players landing at school with us. We can see as we float in for our landing that we have several other players landing at the school with us, as well as a few other players landing at the neighboring compounds. This is important to note because if you manage to survive the initial drop, these are more than likely going to be the next few people you run into. With all that in mind, while you're looting and shooting your way out of the drop, you'll want to keep an ear out for any gunfights going on around your location. Now that we've survived the drop and are ready to make our way into the play zone, the information we gathered earlier about other players nearby is going to come into play. If you did happen to hear shooting during your drop phase, then you're going to want to either prioritize those other players or, at the very least, be keeping their locations in mind as you move towards the zone. Something to consider though is that they may be employing a similar tactic, so it's important to stay alert and be prepared for their advances as well. It's always good to be thinking about player movement in PUBG as if you were in their shoes and what sort of things you might do in their position to gain the upper hand on you. No matter where you land on the map, your mid-game movement and rotations play heavily into the idea of anticipating player location. This calls back to the information the flight path provided because it allows you to deduce other players' locations relative to said flight path and shifting play zones. There are certainly no hard and fast rules to this and it won't be the same every time, but surviving the mid-game in regards to surviving engagements with other players constitutes making several informed predictions based on what information you do have. With that in mind, let's look at an example of how we can use some of this information to our advantage. So based on our flight path and where we landed, we can see several other priority locations that have certainly been looted. Since we know the location of our next play zone, we should be keeping an eye out in that direction in anticipation of other players. Just like you, their priority is making it to the next play zone as well, and you can use this to your advantage. Think of this sort of like base runners in baseball. If there's a runner on first and a ball is hit into play, the priority for the defense is to get the easy out at second base since the runner has no choice but to advance. So, getting ahead of this situation puts you in a position to take them out in transition to their next location. A good tip for this as well is to make sure and pick your moment of engagement when their options for cover are at their lowest. Waiting until they advance to a point where they either have no cover at all or their potential for cover is in equal distance in any direction, allowing you the maximum amount of time to eliminate them from the game. Another key aspect of surviving the mid-game comes in the way of choosing when to investigate compounds and when to avoid them. The best strategy here is always assuming the compound you are approaching is going to be occupied. Sort of like playing blackjack and assuming the dealer is always holding a face card. With that in mind, choosing to play around these compounds can be a strong strategy as long as you're keeping an eye out for potential threats, both from the compound and other areas in which you would be exposed. If you know a building or compound is occupied, then the tactics explained earlier about positioning yourself to intercept or gatekeep any potential players from the next zone puts the advantage back into your hands. The last point to discuss is if you decide to hold or prioritize certain locations. If you happen to land at a more central location or find yourself able to control a location on the map that remains inside each circle up to this point, then I would encourage you to use all of these tips to your advantage as a way to help you anticipate players who might be traveling towards your location. Being able to take control of a building or compound inside the circle can be a major advantage since you'll have good cover to protect you and will more than likely be able to spot enemies before they spot you. The biggest disadvantage this poses though is when the time comes where you might have to leave in order to get to the next zone. This is where I would suggest players pick locations that have safe exits or have a few smoke grenades on them should they need to escape. No matter if you play the edge of the circle or choose to hold up somewhere, the mid-game is all about information. For me, I like making mental notes on the map of things like gunshots or directions vehicles that passed by, then I use that to inform my choices as I progress throughout the game. Even if you could only identify the locations of 3 out of 10 players, it's still helpful to have the powers of deduction on your side. Sometimes knowing where people aren't is just as good as knowing where they are.